Story 1. Whispers Beneath the Pine Trees. I had always liked hiking alone in the Blue Ridge. There was something about the quiet, the way the trees seemed to lean in close, and the wind carried the scent of pine needles and damp earth that made me feel alive, grounded in a way the city never could. That night, though, the forest didn't feel like home. From the moment I stepped onto the narrow trail, a heaviness pressed in on me. The wind was unnaturally still, and the usual chorus of crickets and nightbirds had fallen silent. Each snap of a twig underfoot sounded sharper, closer, as if the forest itself were alert to my presence. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just the heightened awareness that comes when you hike alone at night. But the feeling in my chest told me otherwise. As I ascended the slope, the first whisper reached my ears. I thought it was the wind rustling the lower branches, a trick of sound against the pines, soft and unintelligible. But then it came again, closer, curling around me, soft syllables I couldn't make out. I stopped, ears straining, heart hammering. It wasn't just behind me or ahead, it seemed to come from all directions at once, slipping between the trees like smoke. I called out, hoping for some human presence. But my voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the darkness. The whispers didn't respond, yet they persisted, moving around me, faintly urgent, almost impatient. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe some other hiker had taken the same path, moving quietly to avoid startling me, but the trail was remote, and it wasn't the weekend. No one else should have been out here. I took another step forward, my flashlight casting a narrow circle of light over the mossy ground, but the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. A branch cracked somewhere to my left, making me jump, and I spun, the beam of my flashlight dancing over the twisted trunks. Nothing. Just the black, quiet forest. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every time I thought I'd picked up the trail again, it seemed to loop, doubling back on itself in subtle ways I couldn't explain. Familiar trees appeared where they shouldn't have been. Rocks that I'd passed now blocked the path, and the whispers grew louder, forming patterns I couldn't comprehend. I felt eyes on me, though I knew logically no one could see through that dark, but the sensation was undeniable. My stomach tightened as the whispers shifted tone, from indecipherable murmurs to almost words, soft pleas, urgent and demanding, but just beyond understanding. I moved cautiously, hands brushing against the branches and brush, feeling them scratch my arms and tear at my sleeves. The air was damp, cold, and heavy, carrying the smell of rotting leaves and something faintly metallic that made my stomach churn. My flashlight caught glints of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flitting between two trees, a dark shape that vanished before I could focus. I forced myself to keep walking, telling myself it was my mind playing tricks, that exhaustion and fear were creating shapes that weren't there. But the whispers didn't lie. At one point, I stumbled into a small clearing. The moon had risen higher, thin silver light filtering through the canopy, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. I froze, hoping the clarity would help me make sense of the trail, but instead the whispers multiplied, echoing around the hollow like a chorus of muted voices. I pressed my hands to my ears and crouched low, but it didn't help. They weren't just sounds, they were vibrations in the air pressing against me, a force I couldn't escape. I wanted to run, but the forest itself seemed to resist, roots tangling underfoot, branches clawing at me as if to hold me in place. Desperation forced me to move again. I stumbled over a gnarled root, scraping my knee and elbow, and as I rose, I realized my flashlight had caught something sitting just at the edge of the clearing, hunched, still. I blinked, and it was gone, like it had never been there. My pulse raced, and I tried to keep my voice calm as I whispered to myself, telling myself it was a deer, maybe a large dog. But the weight of being watched settled deeper in my chest. The whispers swirled faster, now a flurry of incomprehensible syllables circling and darting with me as I clawed my way through the underbrush. By the time I broke from the tree line and saw the faint glimmer of my car headlights through the dense pines, my hands were raw, my clothes shredded, and my breathing ragged. I collapsed into the driver's seat, shaking, unable to make sense of what had happened. The forest behind me was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had followed me, that it was still out there, waiting for someone else, or for me to return. I didn't move until dawn, ears straining at every crack and rustle, but nothing came. The trail looked ordinary in the daylight, innocent even, but I knew the truth. Something had been in those trees. Something patient, something that had spoken to me in voices I couldn't understand. I never returned to that path at night. Even during the day, the memory of the whispers gnaws at me, a low, persistent anxiety I can't explain. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I swear I hear them again, faint and distant, just at the edge of hearing. I think about the twists of that trail, the way it seemed to double back on itself, and I realize the forest remembers. It keeps its own secrets, and sometimes it chooses to share them with the living, if only briefly. I don't know if anyone else will ever hear the voices of the pines like I did, or if they would even believe me. All I know is that for one night, the forest had been alive in a way I had never imagined, and whatever whispered to me among the trees, it hasn't stopped. Story 2: Footsteps Along the Ridge. I'd always thought of myself as someone who could handle the quiet of the mountains, the kind of stillness that settles over the Blue Ridge at night. It was a clear, cold evening when I decided to take the ridge trail alone, my flashlight bobbing over the rocks and fallen leaves as I picked my way along the narrow path. The forest was nearly silent, save for the occasional creak of a branch swaying in the faint wind. The solitude was comforting at first, a rare kind of peace, until I started noticing the sounds behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. The trail was uneven, and the gravel crunched underfoot, sending echoes bouncing off the nearby cliffs. But then I heard it clearly. Another set of footsteps, slightly behind me, rhythmically echoing my own. They weren't my shadow or the play of the wind. They were deliberate, heavy on the rocks, following the same pace as I was keeping. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and the echoes stopped. My breath seemed loud in the quiet night. I told myself it was just another hiker, maybe someone camping nearby, but the trail was remote, and no one should have been out here at this hour. I moved forward again, slow and careful, trying to listen. The footsteps resumed immediately, keeping the same distance behind me, never speeding up, never slowing down. My chest tightened with panic. I called out, my voice cracking as it was swallowed by the night air, leaving no reply but the echo of my own words. Every step I took, the sound followed. I tried to convince myself it was my mind, that perhaps the uneven rocks and fallen leaves had created a trick of sound. But I knew better. I could feel a presence there, something patient, something watching me from just out of reach. The ridge wound and twisted in ways that made the journey disorienting. Every bend revealed the same dark shapes of trees and shadowed thickets, but with a subtle unease that made the trail feel unfamiliar. The footsteps never wavered. They stayed behind me, always keeping perfect pace. I began to notice little things. Twigs snapped where I hadn't stepped. Small rocks shifted, but there was no one in sight. The thought that someone could be following me, silent and unseen, sent shivers down my spine. I wanted to run, but part of me feared what that would do, feared that speeding up might trigger whatever was behind me. I rounded a sharp bend near a steep drop, and for a brief second, I thought I saw a figure, a dark shape standing just at the edge of my flashlight's beam. I spun toward it, heart hammering, but it was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. I called out again, louder this time, and my voice sounded strange to me, high-pitched and small. No response came, and the footsteps behind me resumed, cruelly measured, precise. I couldn't tell if whoever, or whatever, it was intended to harm me or simply wanted to make me aware of its presence, but the feeling of being hunted was undeniable. I stumbled over roots and rocks, barely watching where I placed my feet, desperate to reach the trailhead that seemed impossibly distant in the darkness. Each step was mirrored behind me, echoing across the forest like a heartbeat I couldn't escape. I glanced over my shoulder once, fleetingly, and caught the impression of something moving through the shadows, slipping between the trees with a speed that made me think of someone familiar with these trails. In a way, I was not. The night air was thick and cold, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine, but beneath it all there was something metallic, something faintly acrid that made my stomach twist. When I finally glimpsed the faint lights of the trailhead, I ran without thought, my arms catching on branches, my clothes torn by brambles. The footsteps continued for a moment more, then stopped abruptly at the forest's edge, leaving a silence so complete it roared in my ears. I didn't dare look back. I didn't stop until I was in the safety of my car, doors locked, flashlight shaking in my grip. Even as I drove away, the memory of that measured, echoing rhythm lingered, an imprint on my senses I couldn't erase. Days later, I can still hear it. Sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, when the house is still and the wind shifts outside, I catch it, that precise, deliberate crunch of steps following mine. It isn't loud, just enough to make my stomach tighten and my mind race. I replay the night endlessly, wondering what or who it could have been. Someone lost in the woods, a local who knew the trails far better than I ever will, or something else entirely, a presence that moves quietly, patient, invisible, yet fully aware. I can't explain the sharpness of the feeling, the certainty that something was there, waiting for me to notice. I've returned to the mountains during the day since then, hiking the same paths, trying to retrace my steps. Nothing unusual happens in daylight. The forest is calm, familiar, almost welcoming again. But I know better. There are pockets of that forest where the darkness holds memory, where the trees themselves seem to watch, and there are trails where someone, or something, walks behind you, silently marking your path, a quiet echo that follows long after you've left. I can't forget it, and I'm not sure I want to understand it fully. The echo of those steps has become part of me, a reminder that in the Blue Ridge, even the solitude you crave can be accompanied by company you can never see. Story 3. The Lantern That Moved Itself. I had been hiking this trail countless times before, the kind of path that felt almost like an old friend. The trees were familiar, the twists and dips of the ridge etched into my memory, and I often came here to clear my head, to be alone with the quiet of the Blue Ridge at night. That evening, the air was crisp and smelled of damp pine needles, the kind of damp that seeps into your boots and lingers for hours. I moved carefully over the familiar rocks, flashlight bobbing in the dark, when something caught the corner of my eye, a glint of metal resting against a moss-covered tree stump. At first, I thought it was trash, left by some careless hiker, but as I drew closer, I realized it was an old lantern, rusted and weathered, like it had been there for decades. There was an odd pull toward it, a sense that I needed to see if it worked. I knelt and brushed away the leaves, turning it over in my hands. It was heavier than it looked, the glass cloudy with age. I held it up, half expecting it to be useless, and for reasons I can't explain, it flickered to life. A dim golden glow that bathed the immediate area in a soft, trembling light. I froze, the sudden warmth and illumination startling in the still night. I could hear my own heartbeat, thumping in my ears louder than anything else. And then I noticed movement. The lantern began to drift ahead of me, swinging gently in the night air as though some invisible hand were guiding it. At first I laughed nervously, thinking maybe it had caught on a breeze or some unseen vine, but it moved with intent. I stepped forward, hesitant, and the lantern glided further along the trail, never touching the ground. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the trunks and rocks, and I could swear I saw shapes darting just beyond the light. My rational mind tried to explain it. Wind, the uneven ground, tricks of the light. But the deep, instinctive dread coiling in my stomach told me this wasn't ordinary. I ran after it, desperate to catch up, calling out, but my voice sounded distant, swallowed by the trees. Each step I took, the trail behind me seemed to shift, darkening, twisting, as if the familiar path itself had turned against me. The lantern swung ahead like a beacon, coaxing me deeper, and somewhere between the rocks and shadows, I thought I heard laughter, soft, hollow, impossible to place, like someone standing just at the edge of hearing. I froze, the hairs on my neck standing on end, straining to catch any movement. But the forest seemed empty, silent aside from that low, haunting echo of amusement. I forced myself forward, my boots scraping over roots and fallen branches, and the lantern kept just out of reach, moving with the patience of something that had been waiting for me all along. I tried to think rationally, to ignore it, but the golden light carried with it a sense of urgency, a silent insistence that I follow. Each step made me feel smaller, more exposed, as though the trees themselves were watching, leaning in closer, dark shapes pressing at the edges of my vision. The trail twisted unexpectedly, forcing me to navigate unfamiliar angles, despite knowing the path like the back of my hand. Then the laughter came again, closer this time, almost directly behind me. I spun, swinging my flashlight through the trees, but there was nothing, no person, no animal, nothing that could have made that sound. I could feel my pulse in my throat as the lantern swayed gently ahead, and I realized I was trembling from more than the cold. I tried to reach out to grab it, and for a moment I thought I felt it brush my fingertips. But then it moved again, drifting further along the trail, and the path behind me seemed to shrink, the forest pressing in, heavy and silent. Panic rose, but I didn't stop. I ran, boots slipping over damp earth, reaching for the lantern that refused to be caught. Every step felt measured, as if I were part of some ritual I hadn't agreed to, led deeper into a section of trail I didn't recognize. Shadows danced along the edges of my vision, trees appearing taller, trunks darker, the familiar ridge somehow unfamiliar. The golden glow ahead was comforting and terrifying at once, guiding me, but reminding me that I was being observed, manipulated by something I couldn't see. After what felt like an eternity, the lantern tipped sideways and fell to the ground with a soft clatter. The light extinguished instantly, plunging me into darkness so complete it was like the air had been sucked away. My ears rang, and the cold of the night pressed against my skin. I was alone, utterly alone, with only the forest surrounding me, silent and watchful. My flashlight shook in my hands, and I fumbled to catch it, my mind racing with explanations, but none could account for what had just happened. The pull, the deliberate movement, the laughter, it defied logic, and yet I knew I hadn't imagined the sensation of being led, of being watched. I stumbled back along the trail, trying to retrace my steps in the pale glow of my flashlight. But every familiar landmark seemed altered, twisted by shadows. Branches scraped my arms, leaves rustled underfoot, and the forest seemed to lean in closer, quiet but not empty. Even when I finally reached the edge of the ridge, the familiar outlines of the trailhead visible in the distance, the feeling lingered. Someone, or something had been there with me, patient, guiding, observing. The forest had let me go, but not without leaving its mark. Even now, days later, I feel the echo of that lantern. Sometimes I see its golden glow in the corner of my eye, feel the tug of an unseen hand urging me forward, hear faint, hollow laughter when I'm alone at home. I haven't returned to that trail at night, and I don't intend to. Yet the memory of being followed, led and watched lingers, settling into the quiet spaces of my mind, a subtle dread I can't shake. The forest is not just trees and rocks. It remembers, it waits, and sometimes it chooses to reach out. Story 4. Screams from the hollow. I had set up my small tent at the edge of a hollow I'd passed by dozens of times, thinking it a quiet spot to rest after a long day hiking the Blue Ridge trails. The night was still, almost oppressively so, with only the occasional hoot of an owl breaking the silence. The air was damp, carrying the faint earthy smell of decaying leaves, and a light mist began to rise from the hollow as darkness settled in. I made a small fire and watched the flames lick the surrounding trees, the glow illuminating the trunks and casting long, uneven shadows across the clearing. I had no reason to expect anything unusual. Just another calm night alone in the mountains. Around midnight, I first heard it. A scream, high-pitched and raw, filled with panic. I froze, trying to pinpoint its source, but the sound seemed to ricochet through the hollow, impossible to locate. My stomach tightened, and I felt my pulse spike as I strained to hear, listening for the subtle cues of direction. The echoing shrieks were human, unmistakably so, but no one should have been out here. The trailhead was miles away, and the hollow was seldom visited. My rational mind insisted it was an animal, a deer caught in some natural trap or a fox. But the scream carried terror in a way no animal could mimic. Compelled by a mix of fear and disbelief, I left the small safety of my campfire and ventured toward the sound, moving cautiously over the uneven ground. Each step I took made my heart pound harder, every branch snapping underfoot sounding unnaturally loud. The hollow seemed to swallow the light of my flashlight, shadows pooling in the low areas between trees, making familiar shapes foreign and threatening. I called out, my voice cracking with panic, but no answer came. Only the faint echo of the scream lingered, as though mocking me, repeating in distorted fragments. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the hollow felt. The trees leaned closer together, their limbs intertwining like fingers trying to trap me in a maze of darkness. My flashlight beam fell on the underbrush, dense and tangled, yet I could see no movement. The air was thick, carrying a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. Each time I thought I might have found the source of the scream, the noise would stop abruptly, leaving an echoing silence that pressed down on me heavier than the trees themselves. I realized I was following nothing tangible, chasing sound through shadows that seemed to shift with me. At one point, I reached a dense thicket where the ground dipped and the trees grew closer, branches scraping my arms as I pushed through. I stopped, crouching, and peered into the darkness. Nothing moved, no figure, no animal, just the faint glow of my flashlight cutting through the brush. The sense of something unseen watching me was overwhelming. I could feel eyes from somewhere just beyond the beam, unseen but present. A pressure in the back of my mind that made my hair stand on end. The screams had vanished, but the memory of them lingered, echoing in my ears, vibrating through the hollow air as if the fear itself had been absorbed into the trees and soil. I retraced my steps quickly, eager to return to the small patch of cleared ground where my campfire still smoldered. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump, half expecting the scream to resume or something to step out of the shadows. The hollow seemed alive, subtly shifting around me, twisting familiar features into unfamiliar threats. My flashlight beam shook in my hand, and I realized my breathing was shallow, sharp with the adrenaline I hadn't felt in years. When I finally emerged back at the camp, I sank to the ground. Shaking, my hands covered in scratches from the underbrush, my mind racing with the impossibility of what I had experienced. Even as I packed up and moved down the ridge toward the main trail, the hollow continued to feel present. I couldn't shake the impression that whatever had screamed was still there, hidden just out of sight, patient and watching, waiting for someone else to wander too far into its grip. The panic in the voice haunted me in a way I couldn't rationalize, as though the terror itself had been a living thing, tangible and persistent. That night, the forest had felt less like a collection of trees and rocks and more like a presence, a being that absorbed sound, patience and fear in equal measure. The memory of those screams continues to follow me. Even on daylight hikes, in sections of forest I've long thought familiar, I find myself scanning shadows, straining to hear what isn't there. My friends don't believe me. They say it was a fox, a lost hiker, or that I imagined it. But I know what I heard. It wasn't simply a sound. It was a warning, an imprint of raw, human panic, left hanging in the trees where it could be felt but never found. The hollow keeps its secrets tightly, and I've learned not to linger near it at night. Sometimes I swear I hear it again, faint and distant, carried on the wind through the ridge valleys. It doesn't matter that I am miles away, in my house, or driving along a quiet road. The echo of that scream scratches at my memory, pulling me back to the hollow and the night when I was alone with something I could not name. I never return to that clearing, and I never intend to, but every time I hike at night, I find myself avoiding hollows, listening to the slightest noises, feeling the weight of eyes I cannot see. The Blue Ridge is full of beauty, full of calm. But it also has corners that should not be touched, where the forest keeps its own counsel, and where the echoes of terror remain long after the scream has ended. Story 5, Eyes in the Fog. The trail that night was nearly invisible, swallowed by a thick, rolling fog that clung to the trees and flattened the familiar contours of the ridge. I had hiked this path countless times before, but the Blue Ridge looked entirely different under a veil of white mist, familiar landmarks vanishing into an endless grey. I moved cautiously, boots crunching over roots and fallen leaves, flashlight trembling in my hand, each beam of light swallowed almost immediately by the fog. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the occasional drip of condensation from pine needles. I should have felt comforted by the solitude, but something in the air felt wrong, heavy, and unwelcoming. It began subtly at first, a prickling sensation along the back of my neck, like the sense of being watched, though no one was near. Then I saw them. Eyes, just points of reflective light, scattered among the trees, staring at me from the mist. I froze, heart thudding painfully in my chest. The eyes weren't moving toward me, but they weren't blinking or disappearing either. They simply held their position, watching, tracking my every motion. I called out, my voice cracking in the stillness, but it was swallowed immediately by the fog. There was no response, nothing except the silent, unwavering gaze of those tiny, bright points. I tried to rationalize it. Wild animals, perhaps deer, their eyes catching the light of my flashlight. But something about the way they held position, the way they seemed patient and deliberate, made my stomach twist. I moved slowly, testing the air, taking careful steps over roots and rocks, and the eyes shifted with me, mirroring every cautious movement. I stopped, turned slowly, and they moved as well, maintaining distance but never faltering, never closing in. My pulse raced as I realized I could not determine how many there were. nor could I find the edge of their presence. At one point my foot caught on a hidden root, and I fell hard onto the damp forest floor, scraping my palms and knees. The fall startled me, and when I raised my head, the eyes were gone. For a long moment, I felt relief wash over me, thinking perhaps it had all been imagination, or maybe they had retreated at my sudden movement. But the fog remained, thick and unyielding, and the sense of being watched didn't fade. I scrambled to my feet, wiping the blood and dirt from my hands, but the forest seemed transformed. Every tree and shadow was sharper, more sinister, and the silence weighed down on me like a living thing. I began to run, boots slipping on wet roots, fog swirling around me so that even the flashlight was of little help. My own breath sounded unnaturally loud in my ears, and I kept looking over my shoulder, certain the eyes would return, that the watchers would resume their silent vigil. I stumbled multiple times, the ground uneven and slick, and each time I glanced back, my heart sank when I thought I saw movement in the mist. Small flashes of light or the glint of eyes at the very edge of my vision, vanishing when I tried to focus. The trail stretched endlessly ahead. Familiar turns and bends now warped, as if the fog had hidden its contours and twisted the terrain into something I didn't recognize. Panic began to set in fully. The forest, usually a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt hostile, pressing in on me from all sides. I yelled again, hoping to startle whoever, or whatever, was there, though my voice sounded weak, small, swallowed by the thick, damp air. Nothing responded, yet the sense of being observed intensified. The eyes were not playful, not curious. They were patient, and their patience was suffocating, as if they had been waiting for me to wander into their domain. And now they were ensuring I could not leave unmarked. Time lost meaning in the fog. Minutes felt like hours as I blindly ran, following instinct and memory of the trail. Shadows leapt at the corners of my vision, or perhaps I imagined them, but the oppressive feeling of observation never left. I tripped again, sprawling forward over a low branch, and when I lifted my head, the mist seemed to thin slightly. In the distance, I could make out the faint shapes of the parking lot lights, dim and hazy, but unmistakably familiar. Relief surged and I ran toward them, reckless now, sliding on wet earth, branches tearing at my sleeves, mud coating my boots. As I finally emerged into the parking area, the fog began to lift, curling upward with the first hints of dawn. The forest behind me looked ordinary again, the trees familiar and the path clear. But the memory of those eyes stayed with me, bright points of light in the darkness, patient and unyielding, a silent witness to my presence. Even as sunlight touched the ridge and chased the mist away, the sense of being watched lingered in my chest, gnawing at the rational part of my mind that wanted to dismiss it all as imagination. I knew it had not been my mind alone. The precision, the patience, the feeling of being measured and observed. It had been real. I didn't stay long in the parking lot. I drove down the ridge, glancing back occasionally, half expecting to see reflective points in the trees, and though the forest looked calm in the morning light, I could still feel them watching from the edges of memory, following me in ways I couldn't explain. Days later, the chill of that night still grips me when I think of it. The Blue Ridge holds more than moss-covered rocks and pine-scented air. Some corners hide patience, observation, and a quiet menace that remains long after you've left. The watchers, whatever they are not cruel in the conventional sense. They simply exist, and they remember. I haven't returned to that trail in fog since. Even thinking about it makes my skin crawl, my pulse quicken, and the back of my neck prickle as if someone were there, unseen. I know, logically, the forest is empty, that no one, or nothing, is lying in wait. But I remember the eyes, the unblinking points of light that followed my every step without approaching, the quiet insistence that I was not alone. And I know that for one night, I had been observed, measured, and left with only the lingering certainty that some places in the Blue Ridge are never truly empty. Story 6. The Shadow Between the Trees. I had chosen a less traveled path that afternoon, a narrow trail twisting between thick stands of pine and oak, knowing that fewer hikers meant a quieter, more peaceful experience. The forest was dense here, the canopy high and interwoven, muting what little sunlight remained as the day began to fade. I had been hiking for hours, my boots crunching over fallen leaves and loose rocks, when I first noticed it, a shadow that didn't belong. At the edge of my peripheral vision, it moved with a speed and fluidity that no human could match, darting between the trees and disappearing whenever I turned to look directly at it. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a trick of exhaustion, or a deer fleeing at the sound of my boots. I paused, gripping my trekking poles tightly, and tried to scan the forest more carefully. The shadow reappeared, always just out of reach, its shape long and indistinct, yet unmistakably deliberate in its movement. It wasn't running away. It was following, observing, matching my pace from somewhere hidden among the trunks and underbrush. A cold pressure settled on the back of my neck, like the weight of unseen eyes boring into me, and I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but deep down I knew this wasn't ordinary. I started moving again, faster now, scrambling over roots and rocks, the forest floor uneven and treacherous in the dimming light. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself had thickened, pressing against my lungs. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the shadow always stayed at the edge of my vision, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It didn't make a sound, not a snap of a twig or rustle of leaves, only the awareness of its presence. Patient, waiting, precise. I called out once, my voice cracking and echoing strangely, but the forest swallowed it immediately. No reply came, and the shadow continued its relentless, silent pursuit. Branches scratched my arms, and my clothes snagged on brambles as I pushed through the dense forest, heart hammering in my chest. I tried to think logically, reminding myself that the Blue Ridge is home to wildlife, to shadows cast by uneven terrain and low sunlight. But none of that explained the deliberate, watchful quality of the movement. It wasn't just a shape, it was aware. It seemed to study me, to measure me, tracking every motion as if it had always known I would be there. The trail began to open slightly as I neared a small clearing, the underbrush thinning enough that I could see a patch of sky. My relief was immediate, tangible, and I thought perhaps the shadow had vanished. But when I stopped to look, the space felt heavier than the night itself. The forest around me seemed still, almost oppressively quiet, and I realized that whatever had been following me wasn't gone. It had simply disappeared into a place I couldn't perceive, leaving only the weight of its observation behind. I lingered at the edge of the clearing for a moment, catching my breath, and tried to convince myself it had been imagination, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by fatigue. Yet the cold pressure on my neck lingered in memory, and the instinctive sense of being watched refused to fade. The forest was normal again, but I could feel the echo of that shadow between the trees, patient and precise, as if it had been waiting for me to reach that moment of vulnerability, and then decided I was not worth revealing itself fully. I moved quickly off the trail, not caring to follow the path I had intended. The woods around me felt unfamiliar, twisted by fear, every tree and rock suddenly alien. Even though the trail was still visible, I felt as though I were walking through a forest I didn't recognize, guided only by memory and the desire to reach safety. Each step was punctuated by the fear that the shadow could return at any moment, that it might have been observing not just my body, but my mind, testing my reactions, cataloguing my fear. By the time I emerged from the denser trees and onto a wider, more familiar section of trail, the last remnants of daylight were fading, leaving the forest bathed in a dim grey light. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the long, dark shape flit through the trees once more. It never appeared, yet I could feel it in the silence, embedded in the space between the trunks, in the darkness at the edge of my vision. The sensation did not leave me, and even as I drove away from the trailhead later, I could sense its presence lingering in my mind, an imprint of observation that no amount of distance could erase. I have returned to the Blue Ridge since then, hiking during the day when visibility is clear, but I avoid that particular trail, and the section where the trees grow so close together that shadows seem to move independently of the sun. I remember the way the shadow tracked me, patient, unblinking, and the suffocating heaviness of the air while it moved. The forest is not just trees and rocks, it has corners that record your presence, and moments where it watches in silence, leaving you with the knowledge that something unseen is paying attention, always. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I see it between the trees, long and dark, darting with impossible speed, never fully approaching yet never absent. It is a memory that refuses to fade, a quiet dread that has settled into the corners of my mind. I cannot explain it, and I do not try. I only know that something was there, something that was not human, and that the forest in that section of the ridge will never be the same in my eyes again. That shadow remains, patient, waiting, a reminder that the mountains hold more than solitude, more than beauty. They hold vigilance, and sometimes it is trained on you. Story 7: Footprints in the Mud. The trail was slick and heavy with mud from the sudden downpour that had passed through the ridge earlier that afternoon. I had started my hike when the clouds were still grey and brooding, but the rain hadn't lasted long, just enough to soak the undergrowth and leave the earth soft and unstable beneath my boots. As I moved carefully along the familiar path, I noticed something strange. Beside my own footprints, small impressions pressed into the mud, delicate and childlike. At first, I assumed another hiker had passed by recently, but the trail was remote, and I had been alone for hours. The prints were odd, not just in size, but in the way they seemed to loop around me, weaving in and out in patterns that made no sense. I stopped, staring down at the mud, heart starting to thump painfully in my chest. The prints weren't there before, I was certain of that. I hadn't passed anyone, and the forest had been silent until the rain ended. As I knelt to examine them, I realized that they didn't follow a straight path. They curved and spiraled around my own tracks, sometimes appearing beside me, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, as if someone or something had been pacing me, studying my movement and leaving a trail in deliberate patterns. My rational mind raced for explanations. Perhaps a child from a nearby cabin, perhaps some wild animal with oddly shaped feet. None of it felt right. I stood and tried to follow the prints, curious despite the unease gnawing at my stomach. The path led into dense underbrush, brambles snagging my clothes and branches scraping my arms as I pushed forward. And then, abruptly, the prints vanished. One moment they were there, pressed clearly into the mud. The next, they disappeared mid-step, leaving nothing but disrupted leaves and mud. A cold sweat ran down my back as I realized that these prints hadn't been made in any way I could comprehend. They had appeared, circled me, and then vanished like smoke. The forest felt heavier after that, the air thicker, almost suffocating, as if it had absorbed my panic and amplified it. I could feel something watching, patient and unseen, measuring my reactions. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump, my pulse hammering in my ears. I called out, expecting at least the echo of my voice to be met with a response, but the forest only swallowed the sound, leaving me with the oppressive silence of the misted trees. The canopy overhead blocked what little light remained, and shadows pooled unnaturally along the trail. Panic began to set in fully, and I realized I wasn't following the prints anymore. They were leading me into a part of the woods I didn't recognize, twisting around in ways that made the trail feel unfamiliar. My steps became hurried, my boots sinking into the mud, splattering my pants and socks. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I half expected to see a figure emerging from the shadows, a child or something smaller, lingering just out of focus. But there was nothing, just the oppressive weight of the forest pressing in. My imagination running wild with every bend in the trail. I stumbled over a hidden route, sprawling forward onto the soft, wet ground, and scrambled upright, coughing from the sudden jolt of panic. My flashlight beam bounced wildly over the mud and brush, but the prints had vanished completely. For a fleeting moment, I considered that I had imagined them, that exhaustion and isolation had tricked my eyes, but I knew better. The patterns, the sudden appearance, the vanishing act, they had been deliberate. Something had been here, moving with me, circling me, observing every motion, and I had no way to understand it. I ran, boots sliding through mud, trying to reach the familiar curve of the trail that would lead me back to my car. Each step seemed longer than the last, my lungs burning, my arms scraped from branches and thorny vines. The forest around me pressed close, shadows leaning in like fingers, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes at the edges of my perception. I didn't dare look back for long, but a flicker in the mud or a shadow between trees would catch my vision, and I would jerk my head forward again, hoping it wasn't real, hoping it hadn't followed me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the section of trail that opened into clearer ground, where I could see the faint outlines of the ridge and the distant glint of my car through the trees. Relief surged through me, but it was fragile, undercut by the memory of those footprints circling me, vanishing at will. I didn't linger. I ran the last mile to my car, mud slick and panting, throwing my pack in the back seat and starting the engine with trembling hands. Even as I drove down the ridge road, I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see a small figure at the edge of my vision, watching silently. There was nothing, but I could still feel the pressure of observation, the lingering knowledge that I had not been alone. I haven't returned to that section of the trail since. The memory of those footprints circles in my mind as vividly as they did in the mud, a pattern impossible to forget. Sometimes, when I hike elsewhere in the Blue Ridge, I find myself scanning the forest floor, half expecting to see small impressions appearing behind me, leading me deeper into the woods than I intended. I know it wasn't just imagination. The precision, the timing, and the way the prints vanished in mid-step make that impossible. Something or someone had been with me that day, patient, observant, unseen. Even now, months later, I remember the sensation of being watched, the way the forest felt alive in a way it never had before, aware of my every step. I can still feel the mud underfoot, the cold press of unseen attention at my back, the spiraling pattern of small prints circling me with quiet insistence. The Blue Ridge is beautiful and familiar, yet in that section of trail, it holds more than trees and rocks. It keeps its secrets, and sometimes it reminds you with a touch, a pattern, or a trace in the mud that you are never truly alone. Story 8. The Rusted Cabin Door. I was hiking along a little used spur of the ridge, a path I had never paid much attention to before, when I noticed it, a cabin partially hidden behind a tangle of undergrowth and leaning pines. I had walked these woods countless times, studied the maps, yet I had never seen this place. Its weathered logs were grey and slick with moss, the roof sagging in the middle, and the door rusted, hanging crooked on its hinges. Something about it made my stomach tighten, a mix of curiosity and a sudden, unshakable unease. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, listening. And that's when I heard it. A sound so deliberate, it stopped me cold. A slow, dragging movement from inside, as if someone or something was shifting the weight of their body across the floorboards. I called out, my voice small and uncertain, echoing strangely through the trees. There was no reply, but then the door moved. A creak, deliberate and deliberate, swinging open wider than it had before, as though inviting me in or warning me to stay away. I froze, heart hammering, staring at the dark void that had opened behind the threshold. The smell of damp wood and dust hit me as I took a hesitant step closer, my boots sinking into the soft earth littered with fallen leaves and pine needles. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't see anything beyond the doorway, yet the air inside felt charged, heavy, with the kind of presence that presses against your chest and makes it difficult to breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and leave, but something compelled me forward. A mixture of fear and the stubborn curiosity that comes from years of exploring these mountains. I leaned closer, straining to see anything in the darkness. Shadows clung to the corners of the cabin, shifting ever so slightly, but there was no figure, no shape. Only the faint creak of the door as it swayed gently in the breeze. And yet, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as if the cabin itself was alive, and I had trespassed into something that was not meant to be disturbed. I whispered again, this time my voice trembling, asking if anyone was there. The only reply was silence, punctuated by the slow, deliberate settling of the cabin, a groan that seemed almost like a breath, as if the old structure exhaled just for me. My hands shook, and a cold sweat broke across my forehead. I took a half step back, but the presence seemed to follow me, pressing closer in the air, unseen yet tangible. It was the kind of quiet dread that roots you to the spot, makes you hyper-aware of every sound, every rustle outside the doorway, every subtle shift in the shadows. Finally, instinct overrode curiosity, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a gnarled root as I turned to flee. The moment I broke away from the cabin, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that made me jump. I froze in the clearing, heart hammering, convinced that the sound carried more than just wood and rust. It carried intention. The forest around me returned to its usual quiet, but I could feel it, a lingering presence. As if the cabin had exhaled after I left, following me, embedding itself in the space around me. I didn't stop running until I reached the main trail, lungs burning, ears straining for any sound that would suggest pursuit. The trees looked ordinary, the path familiar, yet the memory of that cabin and the sensation of unseen eyes clinging to me refused to fade. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the rusted door slowly swinging open again, yet the clearing was empty, quiet, and the cabin nowhere in sight among the thick pines and undergrowth. It was as if it had been swallowed back into the forest, leaving only its oppressive memory behind. Even days later, as I drove away from the trailhead, I could feel it, that unseen inhabitant, following in my thoughts, pressing against my awareness. The mountains seemed different, smaller somehow, as though I had glimpsed something that existed just beneath the surface of the familiar, something that could reappear at any time, anywhere along these quiet paths. I kept replaying the sounds, the deliberate creak, the subtle groan, the oppressive weight of still air inside the cabin. and each memory made my stomach churn, my skin crawl with the sensation of being observed. I have never returned to that trail, and I do not intend to. Even now, when I hike other sections of the Blue Ridge, I catch myself imagining that same darkness, that same heavy presence lingering behind abandoned structures or fallen trees, patient, waiting. The memory of the cabin door swinging open on its own, of the charged air and the sense of being measured stays with me. The mountains can be forgiving, beautiful, and quiet. But that day, I learned they can also harbor something patient, watchful, and entirely unknowable, and the rusted door remains, in memory at least, an invitation I will never accept. Sometimes, at night, I can feel it again, the weight of its gaze in the back of my mind, and I remember the cabin as more than just wood and rust. It was alive in its own way, charged with the memory of my intrusion, and even without physical presence, it continues to haunt me. The Blue Ridge has always held its secrets, but that cabin reminded me that some are patient, and they never let go of what they've claimed, even if you manage to escape with your life. Story 9. The Howl That Echoed Forever. I had paused on a narrow ridge, the trail beneath my boots soft from recent rains, the air damp and cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. It was late afternoon, though the clouds overhead made it feel closer to dusk, and I was resting on a fallen log, catching my breath after a steep climb. The ridge stretched out below me, a folding tapestry of trees and rocky outcrops, fading into a mist that seemed to hover over the valleys. I had hiked here countless times, but that evening, the forest felt unusually still, as if it were holding its breath. Then I heard it, a long, drawn-out howl that cut through the quiet. At first, I thought it must be a coyote or some mountain dog, but the sound was different, carrying a resonance that no animal I had ever heard could produce. It started low and mournful, echoing off the cliffs and ridges, bouncing and warping in impossible ways. One moment it seemed right beside me, vibrating through my chest, and the next it was distant, fading into the valleys like the mountain itself was crying. I froze, trying to pinpoint the source, scanning the slopes and ridges with wide eyes, but there was nothing, only the trees and rocks, the fog rolling between them like ghostly tides. The howl repeated, long and deliberate, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. My instincts screamed at me to move, to descend the trail and leave that ridge, but my legs felt heavy, rooted by fear and awe. It was almost as if the sound itself had weight, pressing against the air, vibrating in the spaces between rocks and branches. I called out, my voice small and weak, but the echo of my own words faded quickly, swallowed by the mountain. The howl responded, not directly, but with a shift in pitch and intensity, as if it had recognized my presence and was shaping itself around me. I tried to reason with myself. It had to be an animal, some rare predator howling in a way I had never heard before. But even as I repeated that thought in my mind, the sound didn't match any pattern I knew. It didn't carry the erratic cadence of a wolf or coyote. It was long, steady, almost deliberate, and there was a subtle rhythm that made my chest tighten with unease. I listened until the light faded completely, watching the ridge disappear into deep grey shadows, and the howl continued, uninterrupted, moving through the trees, bouncing over cliffs, looping in ways that felt impossible. That night, I camped at a lower section of the trail, trying to convince myself that it was over, that the ridge had simply held a strange, isolated sound. But even from the valley below, the howl reached me, softer now, yet persistent. I lay awake in my sleeping bag, the sound threading into my thoughts, following me as I closed my eyes, repeating in distorted echoes, sometimes distant, sometimes impossibly close. always bringing that cold weight of dread to my chest. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the sensation that something unseen was moving outside the tent. Leaves scraped softly against the canvas, and my imagination painted shapes in the shadows. Every time I thought the sound had ended, it returned in my dreams. In my half-conscious state, circling me, tracing the contours of the mountain, filling the darkness with something I could not name or place. It became impossible to tell where the ridge ended and the sound began, whether it was tied to the geography or to my own awareness, but the effect was the same. My pulse quickened, and my stomach churned with unease. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that the mountain was silent, that the howl had been a one-time phenomenon, a trick of acoustics and wind, but the memory of it lingered in every sense. The way the sound shifted with the cliffs, the way it seemed aware of my presence, moving in ways that no animal instinct could account for. Each time I thought of that ridge, a shiver passed through me, and the chill of unseen eyes accompanied the recollection, as though the howl had left a mark on the place and on me. Weeks later, I returned to the trail but avoided that particular section, sticking to the valleys and ridges I knew well. Even from a distance, the memory of the sound haunted me. When I closed my eyes at night, I could hear it, the low, deliberate wail winding through the trees, echoing over stone cliffs, filling the spaces between rocks and branches. I could feel it not just in my ears but in my chest, vibrating through my bones, a reminder that the mountains keep their own rhythm, and sometimes it is one we are not meant to understand. Even now, months after that hike, the memory persists. I've spoken to local hikers and rangers, but no one else can place it, and the ridge remains quiet to them, ordinary. But I know what I heard. The howl was deliberate, patient, and unplaceable, a sound that carried intent without form. It circles in my mind, echoing through memories, tugging at the edges of my perception, a reminder that some corners of the Blue Ridge are not just wild, but alive with something inscrutable, something that observes, waits, and lingers far longer than any human footprint. I cannot explain it, and I do not try. All I know is that the howl exists in the spaces between memory and imagination, a low, mournful thread woven through the mountains, circling eternally. And the moment I heard it, I realized that the Blue Ridge holds more than trees and rock. It holds voices, echoes, and traces of awareness that may never be meant for human ears. Every time I hear a night wind over the ridge, I remember it, and the chill returns, quiet but insistent, a weight pressing against the chest that I have carried with me ever since. Story 10. Cold Hands from the Darkness. I had been hiking a narrow, winding trail that clung to the edge of a steep drop, the kind of path where one misstep could send you tumbling down into the dark woods below. The late afternoon sun had vanished behind thick clouds, and the forest was settling into a quiet that felt too complete, the kind that presses against your ears until every small sound is amplified. I paused for a moment to catch my breath, resting my hand against a gnarled tree trunk that leaned precariously over the slope. The wind was light, whispering through the branches, and I could hear the faint rustle of leaves far below. It was peaceful until I felt it. I sensed it first as a cold brush against my neck, a fleeting chill that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. And then the grip, a hand, icy and impossibly firm, closing over my shoulder. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my footing, expecting to see another hiker, a prankster, someone who had been following the trail behind me. But there was nothing. The path stretched back into the gloom, empty and silent, the trees still and motionless. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I felt a tremor run through my legs, making it difficult to stand still. I started moving again, boots crunching over the gravel, trying to convince myself that it had been a trick of the wind, a branch brushing against me, or the imagination of someone too tired and isolated. But the sensation followed, subtle at first, a cold finger brushing along my arm, a chill against the small of my back that vanished when I turned. My steps quickened, and I could feel my skin prickle as though unseen eyes were moving along the trail, pacing me, waiting. The forest had shifted from peaceful to oppressive, the shadows leaning closer as I passed, twisting and stretching in ways that seemed almost deliberate. Every twist in the trail brought the same sudden pressure, a phantom touch that left my nerves raw. I dared not speak, not even whisper, for fear that the sound might draw attention or provoke whatever presence lingered in the trees. The path, normally familiar, began to feel alien, each boulder and root taking on a menacing quality, every shadow suggesting a form just out of sight. I ran when I could, careful not to trip on the uneven trail, yet constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure, or at least the source of the cold hand, but there was nothing. Only the trees, the slope, and the oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. I remember the panic well, the way the forest seemed to pulse with my fear, how every step echoed unnaturally, and the occasional brush of cold against my clothing that was far too precise to be mere wind. My heart raced as I stumbled over roots and stones, scrambling toward a bend where I could see the faint glimmer of a familiar clearing ahead. And yet, even as I approached the lighter space, the cold hand seemed to linger, a reminder that I was not as alone as I had thought. It was patient, unseen, and precise, brushing where it knew I would feel it most, a sensation that left goosebumps crawling along my arms and neck. By the time I reached the clearing and finally caught sight of the lower trailhead, I was breathless and shaking. I did not stop to look behind me, only pushed forward, boots sliding over mud and loose stones. The sun had fully set by then, leaving the woods bathed in a dim grey that felt almost solid, as though the darkness itself was pressing down around me. I could still feel the lingering sensation of the icy grip at the edge of my perception, a memory etched into my nerves that refused to fade. Even now, long after I left that trail, the memory is vivid. Every time I hike at night or along a narrow ridge, I check over my shoulder, half expecting to feel that cold hand again, pressing down or brushing against my back. I know the forest holds many secrets, and I've walked alone enough to trust that some of them are real, tangible, and entirely inexplicable. That night, whatever it was, followed me with patience and precision, leaving me shaken, aware of just how thin the line between solitude and observation can be in the Blue Ridge. The memory returns in quiet moments, a gust of wind over a ridge, the brush of leaves against my shoulder, or the heavy stillness of the forest before night falls. In those moments, I feel the presence again, not physical, not visible, but unmistakable, a cold weight that presses against the skin, testing, reminding me of its existence. I don't speak of it much, not even to other hikers, because rational explanations feel inadequate. There is nothing to explain the sensation, and no one else seems to have encountered it in quite the same way. It is personal, a quiet terror lodged deep within the memory of that night. I avoid that trail now, sticking to wider paths, to daylight hikes where the shadows cannot reach so easily. And yet, the memory persists, in the tightening of my chest when I hear the wind through the trees, in the way I pause mid-step on narrow paths. Imagining the weight of a hand that cannot be seen. It is a lesson I cannot unlearn, that even in the familiar, even in the daylight and among the trees I've walked for years, there is room for something unseen to reach out, to brush against you, and to leave a memory that chills you long after the trail is behind you, even when I sleep. The recollection of that icy grip returns. Not violent, not sudden, but patient, lingering, a reminder of the unseen presence that followed me along that narrow ridge. I do not know what it was, nor do I want to. The thought of finding it again is enough to keep me wary, alert, and respectful of the quiet, dark corners of the Blue Ridge. Some encounters do not end, and some presences never leave, embedding themselves in memory with a weight that cannot be lifted. Story 11. The Cabin That Weren't There. I had been hiking a little used trail along the ridge, the kind where the forest closes in so tightly that sunlight barely reaches the moss-covered floor. The air was damp from an earlier rain, carrying the earthy scent of wet leaves and pine needles. I was tired, but the sky had begun to darken, and the fading light made the forest feel heavier, more deliberate in its silence. That's when I saw it. A cabin tucked just into a small clearing, partially hidden behind a cluster of young pines. A soft glow shone through what looked like windows, the kind of warm, golden light you imagine when you picture a hearth or lantern. My chest tightened with a mixture of relief and curiosity. After hours on the trail, it seemed like a welcome refuge. I called out softly, expecting maybe an occupant, a hiker like myself, or perhaps a ranger cabin left unlocked. There was no reply, only the faint hum of the wind through the trees. I stepped closer, careful, boots crunching softly on the leaf-strewn ground, and the light remained steady, flickering ever so slightly as if moved by a breeze. My curiosity overcame the unease creeping up my spine. I had hiked alone enough to know that any cabin in these woods was unusual, especially one I'd never seen on any map. And yet, as I took another cautious step forward, the cabin seemed to recede, the edges of its roof blending with the trees, the windows dissolving into darkness. I stopped abruptly, my pulse spiking, staring at the clearing that was now empty. The light, the structure, the entire cabin, gone. I spun around, expecting perhaps to have missed a turn or a shadow, but there was nothing. Just the wet forest floor, slick with rain, and the trees standing silent and tall. The clearing remained, but it was hollow, empty, as if the cabin had never been there at all. My stomach turned cold, and I took a step backward, tripping slightly over a gnarled root, and for a moment, the clearing seemed to stretch unnaturally, wider than it should have been, the trees bending toward me like silent witnesses. I tried to retrace my steps along the trail I had just hiked, but nothing matched what I had seen. The familiar twists of the path, the placement of rocks and fallen branches, all seemed slightly altered, as if the forest itself had shifted to obscure the memory of the cabin. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what had happened. Exhaustion, tricks of the light, shadows forming shapes that weren't there. But something about the glow had been too vivid, too tangible, and the sense of presence, the feeling that someone or something had been inside watching me, lingered like a weight pressing on my chest. I eventually set up my tent on a lower section of the trail, shaking off the feeling of unease as best I could. I didn't dare look back toward the clearing. That night, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me flinch. The wind shifted, brushing against my tent like a deliberate touch, and I felt the hollow weight of eyes I could not see. Sleep was shallow, punctuated by dreams in which the cabin appeared just beyond the edge of the trees, glowing softly, always retreating when I approached. I woke several times to check my surroundings, heart racing, convinced that at any moment it might reappear in the forest behind me. In the morning, I packed quickly, the image of the vanished cabin still pressing against my mind. I walked the trail slowly, constantly scanning for anything that might explain the previous night's vision. I found nothing, no traces of light, no signs of human habitation, no lanterns or fire pits. Only the forest, wet and silent, as if it had swallowed the cabin whole. and yet the memory of that light and the unshakable feeling of being observed clung to me, a residue that refused to fade. Even days later, back in town and among friends, I couldn't shake the sense that the cabin had followed me, that it existed somewhere between memory and the forest itself, just beyond perception. The sensation returned in quiet moments, the rustle of the wind through trees, a flash of golden light at the corner of my eye, reminding me that the encounter had not been entirely a figment of my imagination. There was a presence, patient and deliberate, tethered to the clearing where the cabin had appeared, and it seemed to watch, waiting for me to return. I never did. I avoid that section of trail entirely now, taking longer routes around the area, and yet, in my mind, the cabin persists. I can still see the lanterns glow, the faint warmth behind the windows, and feel the cold, quiet weight of whatever had occupied the space. It is not the fear of a person or predator. It is something subtler, more deliberate, a reminder that even in the quietest forests, some things exist just beyond our ability to confirm them, waiting to be noticed, willing to vanish the moment we try to confront them. That memory is sharper than most. It returns without warning, in the way shadows fall across a room or when the light catches a tree just right. I feel it now when I hike at night in other sections of the mountains, the subtle hint of being observed, the lingering sense of a hidden structure, a presence that the forest refuses to reveal completely. The cabin that wasn't there taught me to trust the weight of what cannot be seen and to respect the quiet spaces of the Blue Ridge, for they hold more than trees and rocks. They hold remnants of attention, patience, and watchfulness that persist far longer than any human footprint. Story 12. The Trail That Led Nowhere. I had set out early that morning, intent on hiking a trail I hadn't explored in years. The map suggested it would be a simple ascent to a ridge overlooking the valley, but from the moment I stepped onto the faint path, something felt off. The forest was unusually still, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until every small sound seems amplified. Birds were absent, and the usual hum of insects was subdued, almost as if the woods were holding their breath. The trail itself was barely more than a faint line in the moss and leaf litter, winding between trees so close together their branches intertwined overhead. I told myself it was just a lesser-used path, but a creeping sense of unease began to settle in my chest. At first, the trail seemed normal, but after several minutes, I noticed that the landmarks around me, the same gnarled oak, a moss-covered boulder, a small stream bend, kept repeating. I would pass a formation of roots, glance ahead, and see it again as if I had stepped backward without noticing. My steps grew hesitant, my heart starting to race. The path narrowed unnaturally, twisting in ways that made no sense, doubling back on itself or curving around trees in impossible angles. I tried to follow it quickly, hoping to reach some sign of the ridge, but the more I walked, the more it felt like the trail had become a maze, deliberately rearranging itself to confound me. Panic began to set in as the sky darkened unexpectedly behind the thick canopy. Each step forward seemed to lead me back to the same clearing, the same twisted roots, the same stone markers. I called out, hoping for the sound of another hiker or even a distant vehicle, but my voice was swallowed entirely by the oppressive silence. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching longer, pressing closer, as if the trees themselves were watching. I stumbled over hidden roots, tripped on rocks, and spun around repeatedly, desperate to find any sign that I was moving in the right direction. Hours seemed to pass, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell. The sun was gone entirely, replaced by a grey, oppressive dusk that filtered through the branches. I realized with a sinking feeling that the trail was no longer leading anywhere familiar. The looping patterns had trapped me, the forest's undergrowth thickening to the point where I could barely force my way through. I abandoned the path entirely, pushing into the denser woods, limbs scraped by thorny bushes and branches that seemed intent on holding me back. Every direction looked the same, and every sound, snapping twigs, distant rustles, the whisper of wind through leaves, felt amplified and deliberate. At one point, I thought I saw a faint glow, perhaps a break in the trees or a clearing, and I moved toward it with desperate hope. But as I approached, the light vanished, leaving only the grey, suffocating shadows of the forest. My chest heaved, sweat and cold mingling on my skin, and a hollow feeling of being observed settled over me. It wasn't just the fear of being lost. It was the sensation that the woods themselves had eyes, tracking my every movement, waiting for a moment of weakness. My compass and map were useless. They seemed to turn against me, directions meaningless, landmarks repeating endlessly. I pressed on blindly, stumbling over roots, sliding down muddy slopes and forcing my way through dense thickets. The forest seemed alive in a way I couldn't explain, bending and shifting just enough to disorient me further. My sense of time fractured. I couldn't tell if I had been walking for an hour or several. Every step brought the same repetitive scenery, each turn of the trail mirroring the one before. I began to speak aloud, naming trees, rocks, and small formations, trying to convince myself that the world was still coherent, that I wasn't caught in some endless loop. The more I spoke, the louder the forest felt, the shadows leaning closer, listening. Dawn eventually broke, but it brought little relief. The fog hung thick among the trees, and the trail I had been following had vanished entirely beneath a carpet of wet leaves and moss. I emerged into a small clearing just as the first pale sunlight cut through the mist, disoriented, soaked, and trembling. There was no ridge, no road, no evidence that I had ever been on a proper path. Just the same forest, quiet now, indifferent, and the lingering weight of hours, or what felt like hours, spent trapped in a place that should not have existed as it did. Even after I returned home, the memory of that trail haunted me. The disorientation, the feeling of being trapped, the way the forest seemed to bend reality itself, all of it remained vivid. Every hike I take now carries the shadow of that day. The fear of repetition, of looping paths, of trails that don't lead anywhere but deeper into the same forested confusion. I can still picture the trees pressing in, the mossy ground repeating itself endlessly, and the hollow feeling of being observed by something that existed just beyond the reach of my perception. It is a lesson that sticks with me, one I cannot shake. Some trails in the Blue Ridge are not meant for passage, or perhaps they are meant to remind those who wander of how fragile the sense of direction, of safety, truly is. The forest can be patient, deliberate, and cruel in its silence. The memory of that trail lingers in the back of my mind, a quiet dread that returns in moments of isolation. When I walk at dusk, when fog settles over a familiar path, when the wind seems just a little too deliberate, I know now that some corners of the woods hold more than trees and rocks. They hold a presence, subtle and unrelenting, that disorients, isolates, and leaves a mark long after the hiker has escaped.